Responsibility. An ongoing inquiry into the origins and evolution of American government. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also the host of this discussion, and here he is, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Agnes, and welcome to our program on this Wednesday. Today is the 18th day of January in the year 2017. It is a pleasure to be with you today. We've been talking about not the numbers of months and then the numbers of days before the inauguration, before the beginning of a Donald Trump presidency. Now we're down to hours. We are 47 hours from the inauguration, which will occur at noon on Friday. So the countdown is on, as I would say. Toward what? We don't quite know. That's part of the issue, it seems to me. But anyway, it is a pleasure to be with you on this Wednesday, the 18th day. We've passed the midpoint of the month of January, and I hope everybody is doing well, and everybody, so far at least, is enjoying the new year. And I just wanted to make you aware of the fact that, you probably are aware if you're a regular listener, that we didn't do a live program yesterday. On Tuesdays, we usually do our 90-minute abbreviated program. I had a meeting scheduled yesterday out of town, and it was related to something that we've talked about here at the Virtual Center. So I wanted to kind of share it with you at the beginning of today's program, and not only to explain why I missed the program, but more importantly to kind of give you an update on this particular program. It relates to the program that myself and a couple of my colleagues put together to address the issue of undereducated and uneducated, unskilled adults, focusing initially here in southern West Virginia, but very honestly, we're optimistic enough to believe that if the thing gets going and people begin to recognize that indeed this can work, then it could be picked up in various other places, other states, various things. So there's no limit to what this idea could accomplish, if we can get it off the ground. And that's what I've been working on, is trying to get it off the ground. And I think we mentioned quite a bit about the program here on the air, I know, not too long ago. But one of the things I remember mentioning some weeks ago is the difficulty of trying to market a program like this to existing higher education institutions, to colleges and universities especially. In fact, it began to seem to appear to be so hopeless that I even basically thought, well, maybe the best thing to do is not worry about any kind of endorsement from higher education at the beginning. Maybe what we might do is go in a different direction, target a different population, as it were, get the program started and underway, and thereby be able to demonstrate and validate the effectiveness of the program, and then perhaps higher education would buy into it at a later point. And I had tried to do that. Well, yesterday, as I mentioned, I did have a meeting and on this particular program, and it was with a good friend of mine who is a member of the state legislature here in West Virginia. He's been the chair of the Board of Governors at one of our state colleges, universities actually, here in West Virginia. He's been a member of the Senate, and what really prompted me to contact him was that I had read in the media not too long ago that our incoming governor, who actually is not incoming anymore, he was inaugurated on Monday, had appointed the same person to his transition team, more specifically to the transition team on education. And I thought this is an opportunity, and it just happens that he and I go back a few years. And actually, I can go back even further than that. Turns out that he grew up when they were young kids with my stepson, and they've been lifelong friends. And so once I came into the picture as his stepdad, and I basically was enabled to meet and get to know this fellow myself, and came to enjoy him and appreciate him. And of course, the relationship that he had with my stepson meant that that it started off on pretty good footing. I kind of liked him before I even met him, I guess is what I can say. But anyway, it was with him that I had the meeting yesterday. And the reason I'm mentioning all of this is because I wanted to give you kind of an update just quickly as to one aspect of the meeting, which I thought was extremely relevant. After the meeting was over, I had, over an hour to drive home, and I was reflecting on the ups and downs, pros and cons of the meeting as I was driving back home. And this is what really prompted me to kind of take a moment at the beginning of our program today and share this with you. One of the concerns that he had with the program is the seeming lack or absence of standards. Most of the program addresses the issue of standards after the fact. In other words, what we're basically talking about is maintaining or designing an academic program that meets or exceeds existing standards. One of the things we commit to, for example, is to get those who graduate from our program, those who complete it, to perform successfully on the ACT exams or on the college boards. Because what we want to do is be able to present our graduates as validated, qualified students for admission to colleges and universities around the country. And basically what we're talking about is providing an academic program that's designed to take us in that direction with that result. In other words, successful performance on the college boards would be one way to validate the success of the program, namely to demonstrate the competency of the students who graduate from the program. But the issue of standards that was the point of our conversation yesterday was the standards of incoming students. And basically what was pointed out is the proposal said nothing about what it takes to qualify for admission to the program. And basically my response to that is, well, there aren't any. What we're talking about are those for whom our existing education institutions, K through 12, has not been successful. I mean, we're talking about targeting people whose experience in the education pipeline up to this point has been not successful. And consequently, what we are confronted with are a substantial number, and in some states the number is higher than others. Here in West Virginia, it's huge. The number of people who don't have sufficient work skills to be attractive to employers in today's more challenging world of work. They don't meet academic standards for admission into traditional colleges and universities. But more than that, because in many cases they come from backgrounds which are not college backgrounds. Their parents, for the most part, didn't go to college. These people have experienced no success in the game of education up to this point. So basically, what they are facing is a lifetime of frustration and a lack of opportunity and a lack of hope, a lack of access. In other words, what I was telling the person that I was talking to yesterday is we are not imposing standards for admission into our program. What we're basically suggesting is that as a result of our program, graduates will meet standards by gaining access in areas where they didn't have it before. The point that I wanted to make about this, and the reason I mention it at all, is because it speaks to the kind of assumptions that really drive our approach to education in this country at all levels. The assumption is that young people, students, must demonstrate competency before they are allowed to learn, before they are given the opportunity to engage meaningful content and substance. And the proposal that we're talking about, the program that we're talking about, flips that totally around and said it's the engagement with content and the questions and challenges that content raises that bring the necessary skills to handle it into play. The skills are there. They need to be developed. They need to be honed. And in order to do that, people must be put in situations where they have a need to know something that they don't have the skills they need to address this challenge or to find out what they don't know. Basically, then, what I'm saying is that the requisition or the requirement of standards at the front end of any academic program becomes the means by which people have been denied access. And what we're talking about is eliminating that whole process, assuming that everybody has access. But the purpose of the program is to be honest with people and say at a particular point in time, it's obvious from the work that you've already submitted and the kinds of questions you have and the questions you raise that this particular kind of program is not for you. And basically, you ought to think in a different direction. So in a sense, the program itself would become the standards. The efforts of individuals to perform successfully within the program is the demonstration of the necessary standards we're talking about. And so what we're talking about is a program where evaluation would be constant, would be frequent. What we are basically saying is, if a person comes into the program with the necessary motivation and is willing to work with us, we'll demonstrate and show how to develop the tools to master the program. What we don't have time for are people who are going to enter the program and then start missing classes, not completing assignments, and all the rest of it, so that they would end up in a traditional program taking an inordinate amount of time away from other students. Basically, the priority here would be, we've got too much to do and too much of a crunch to provide for the students who are taking the program seriously. We don't have time to waste on students who are not. That's the only standard, is the willingness to work with us and give it a go. And we'll do the rest. It's very, very difficult to make that case, because so much of what we do is based on standards, minimum standards. We've talked previously here at the Virtual Center about just in education, for example, the assumption that students need to be able to demonstrate that they read at a certain level before they're allowed to take on the challenges of literature or poetry or fiction, novels, or anything else. And the fact of the matter is, what that means is we're teaching reading as if it were a discipline in its own right. We're teaching reading as if it was history or math or English or science or something like that. The fact of the matter is, reading is a skill toward the pursuit of knowledge. And it seems to me that the need to read better than one currently reads is going to be presented by the challenges of knowledge that you lack sufficient skills to master at this point. In other words, you're confronted with a form of learning that requires a level of reading and analysis that's higher than you can currently perform. And then theoretically a second party comes in, an outside party, in this case a coach comes in and says, all right, here's your problem. Here are some of the things you can do to address that, to solve that problem and improve your skills so you can handle this particular challenge. The challenge needs to be presented before the skills necessary to handle that challenge come into play. It's very, very difficult when you think about it to teach people to hone skills when there's no reason to do it. When all they're in effect doing is demonstrating that they can read at a level so that they can be presented challenges. It seems to me that wrestling or the desire or the need to engage content is the prime motivator for learning. And our education system must present that first. We must turn the equation totally around. And that, it seems to me, is demonstrated or reflected in the question about what are the admission standards? What level do people have to be able to demonstrate that they are performing at before they can gain access to this program? Very, very difficult to break through some of these long-term assumptions that have driven our education system for so long. And that's kind of what we're trying to do. So anyway, I will say in conclusion that I thought that our meeting yesterday was extremely positive. It is going to be followed up by another meeting, which is a very positive in its own right. And we didn't get the door closed in our face, so we weren't ushered out of the room or anything like that. So since the meeting didn't go badly, one must assume that it has some positive potential. At least that's the way I feel about it. But anyway, I want to share this with you, the comment about standards, because I think it reflects the ongoing assumptions that we have. And it's extremely difficult to explain to people, because what it means is that we go into a program like this with the idea that everybody can learn to a certain point, that everybody has the opportunity to learn better, read better than they do now. And if we provide them the kind of academic or intellectual challenges which demand these kinds of enhanced skills, then the individual will be driven to develop those skills. And that's exactly what we want. We are using the desire to know as the principal motivator in an education system. And we don't do that. And my feeling is, once people who matter can see this actually happening, then I think it'll only be a matter of time before the necessary changes in our regular education systems begin to happen. I would suggest to you this is the key. And but anyway, I'm obviously committed to what I'm doing. My challenge, obviously, is to convince other people of the same thing. I got into that little story, and I neglected to provide the kind of basic information that we do every day here at the Virtual Center, which is to encourage our listeners to participate in the program and avail themselves of the opportunity to call up and get on the air and discuss some of these things. So let me do that. We do have a phone number. We do invite you. We'd love to hear from you on this issue or a number of other issues, and we'll get to what I think are going to be major issues in today's program in a moment. The phone number in question is area code 304-663-4676. 304-663-4676. If you're a little bit reluctant to go on the air, but at the same time you'd like to share your thoughts with me in an email one-on-one, I'd be privileged to receive such an email from you. I promise you, I'll commit to the fact that I will acknowledge receipt of your email. I'll respond to it as best I can, as substantively as I can. If I am able to add substance to your email, I'll try to do that. If I can't, I will say that. My email address is waobrien906 @gmail.com. That's waobrien, OBRIEN 906 @gmail.com. And then finally, I do encourage you to check out our Facebook page. I did put a posting on there last evening, I believe. I worked on it quite a bit. I had said in Monday's program that I was going to post something related to our program, the program we did on Monday, on Facebook, and I made up my point yesterday that even though we weren't doing our regular program live, I would use whatever time I had to try to get something substantive on Facebook. And by last evening, I was able to do that. And I put an item on Facebook, which actually is a little bit longer than much of the material that I put on Facebook. I introduced it or put it on Facebook with the link to the article that we talked about on Monday's program, which is the whole question of not including people of color in the colonial period, the late colonial period, and after. We're talking principally about African Americans and Native Americans in the game plan of American independence. Professor Annette Reed Gordon actually, I need to go back and check because I'm not sure that it's Annette Gordon Reed. That's what I thought. I got the name, the surname reversed. Dr. Annette Gordon Reed, who's a history professor at Harvard and heads up the legal history program there at Harvard, did a review in the New York Review of Books on this particular book on the independence movement. And let me go back and share with you the title of the book. Annette Gordon Reed's article in the New York Review of Books, dated January 19th, is entitled "The Captive Aliens Who Remain Our Shame." And the book under review is by Robert Parkinson, published by the University of North Carolina Press. And the title of Mr. Parkinson's book is "The Common Cause: Creating Race and Nation in the American Revolution." And that is a book that we spent the better part of an hour on Monday. And of course, most of the substance of the program was in the review that appeared in the New York Review of Books. And I spent a little bit of time on Monday talking about the quality of the reviews that are done in the New York Review. When you read the reviews in the New York Review, you pretty well know whether this is a book that you want to go and take the time to read, because you'll know quite a bit about it once you read this review. They're that substantive. And that's what Annette Gordon Reed's book does with with Parkinson's book, Common Cause. And we spent time on it on Monday, and I'd like to take a moment, sometime today, to go back to it, because I genuinely do believe that this is a critically important issue, the issue of race. And as I said, I was able to post on Facebook a link to this particular article, and in it to share what I think are issues that make this particular article critically important. In our conversation. Basically, you'll recall, and I'm trying to pull papers together here. Basically, you'll recall that the basic tenet is, and this is really a summary of what I put on Facebook. The basic tenet of Parkinson's book is that we've really missed a large part of the story about race in America, especially as it played out in the early years. Parkinson's goes back and looks at the origin of the movements toward independence in the early 1770s. And points out that the decision as to whether slaves, blacks, and or Native Americans, the issue as to whether they would be considered full players in the republic that the independence movement was aimed or designed to create, was an issue that was addressed and answered even prior to the outbreak of the war, even prior to Lexington and Concord. That in effect, the only way to really understand the independence movement and the war for independence that led to it is to understand that from the very beginning, there was never the intent to include blacks and or Indians in the republic as full-blown citizens. That in effect, in order to make the independence movement successful, the leaders of it throughout the colonies recognized that merely stating abstract principles, as the Declaration of Independence does, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that in order to protect these rights, governments are created among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, on and on and on. Those statements of principle are very important. But the fact of the matter is, they are not by themselves enough to spur a war for independence. People, for the most part, are not going to risk life and limb in order to defend the principles in the Declaration of Independence. In order to build a successful independence movement Parkinson explains, the founders realized that it was going to be necessary to create a united movement, what he calls a common cause, something that northern colonists, southern colonists, middle colonists of different religious backgrounds, of different national backgrounds, whether they came from Ireland or whether they came from Great Britain or whether they came from France or whether they came from Southern Europe and Eastern Europe, Germans and all the rest of it. Whatever their national origins were, what had to happen is that some way to create a sense of common cause, the idea that we're all on the same side, we're all in this together, and we need to fight together in order to make this effort successful, was part of the game. If they weren't able to do that, then the struggle for independence was doomed from the beginning. And in order to build that movement, Parkinson tells us, it was necessary to tell stories, to create a narrative, to create a sense of story that produced that common cause, that demonstrated or reflected or validated the existence of that common cause. The decision was that the only way to do it was to somehow sever the connection that many colonists had with the mother country. Many colonists believed that they were indeed subjects of the British Empire, that they were as much British as the people who were still in the mother country, and that therefore it was going to be very difficult to get them to take up arms against the mother country when they felt that they were still psychologically and culturally a part of that mother country. That what you had to do was build in a separation, drive a wedge, if you will, between the colonies and the mother country. And it was clear to many people that the best weapon in order to make that wedge happen was race. Was the innate racism, if you will, that many people believed, the suspicion and the negativism that people had towards African Americans, Native Americans, or whatever. That what you had to do was use that reality, the reality of race, as the basis for separating the psychological connection or affinity between colonists and mother country. And the way to do that was to play on and play up the degree or extent to which the British used the race card in order to try to crush the independence movement. In many cases, for example, promising slaves their independence if they would take up arms against their masters and against their colonial government. Promising slaves their freedom in return for taking up arms on behalf of the mother country against the colonists, against the revolutionaries. And the same thing was true about British efforts to ally with and use Indians against colonists. Consequently, stories began to appear throughout the colonial newspapers, and Parkinson includes in his book, which is 540 some odd pages long, details of the articles and items from colonial newspapers which validate the degree to which different colonies used race in order to play up the separation between colonists and mother colonists in mother country by suggesting that the mother country was using blacks and Indians as proxies for their war to crush the colonists and crush the independence movement. And the fact of the matter is, what Parkinson points out is that many of these stories were planted. Many of them were stories about Indians cooking and eating white Americans and these kinds of things. Many of them weren't true, but they were there as part of a movement to build a common or create a common cause. They became the essence of the narrative that was created and expected to result in the common cause that would make independence a success. What I put on Facebook and what we talked about on Monday was how significant this particular study is. Because what it does is demonstrate reasons why our war against racism in this country has never been successful. There have been numerous times throughout our history that race has reared its head. Of course, the most obvious one's the Civil War itself. But the riots in the 60s and 70s, the inner city riots, the riots in New England, in northern cities over busing, during the Jackson administration, the infamous Trail of Tears, moving Indians west of the Mississippi in order to gain access to their land so that you could encourage white colonial settlement. In other words, it was very clear from the very beginning, Parkinson says, that in this republic, citizenship was to be considered tantamount to being white. And from the very beginning, there was a sense of intentional discrimination based on race built into the fabric of the American experience. What that explains then is why we've had such a difficult time addressing successfully the race question in this society. Because in part, it's been based on mythology. We have convinced ourselves, mainly I think because we've realized that it's much more convenient politically to think this way. We have allowed ourselves to assume that racial tensions in this country are somehow the product of slavery. That because millions of Africans were brought to this country against their will, this meant that there was a built-in racial hostility in the country which would take generations to dissipate. The thinking was, the optimistic belief was, that if we can hang on long enough, as generation replaces generation, the psychological connection with slavery will weaken. And eventually, at some point, the racial question will resolve itself. We've really believed that. In fact, there have been movements about whether there ought to be compensation included in order to expedite, to speed up this process. But the fact of the matter is, What Parkinson's book demonstrates is that society has never really been willing to take on the issue directly, head on. And that is that from the very beginning, the entire social fabric was built upon and intended to incorporate racial issues within itself. It seems to me, an absolutely critical component of our history. I wanted to share with you a particular quotation from Annette Gordon-Reed's review that I put on Facebook. She says, and this is a quote from Parkinson's book, "Men like Jefferson, Adams, Franklin, and Washington developed a myth about who was and who was not a part of the revolutionary movement, about who had an interest and who did not. Other advocates of the revolution, Thomas Paine, Lafayette, joined the effort. According to Parkinson, these men chose to prosecute the American War for Independence in a way that put race at the heart of the matter. They helped foment racial prejudice as the principal means of creating unity across the 13 colonies in order to prepare Americans to do battle with Great Britain. The base sentiments they promoted for political expediency survived the fighting, and the narrative that dismissed blacks and native peoples as alien to America and conflated white with citizen lived at the heart of the republic it helped to create for decades to come," Parkinson said. "It kept both groups from inclusion as Americans." Parkinson is blunt about the results of this program, and this is a direct quote from Parkinson's book. "This refusal to extend to African Americans and Indians the benefits of emerging concepts of liberal subjectivity in the form of citizenship had ghastly consequences, for it legitimated and excused the destruction of vast numbers of human beings." This is then the issue that must be confronted before we can successfully resolve the racial tensions in this society. And we know what those racial tensions have exploded into. They emerged in the battles in the inner cities. We had the burning of Los Angeles in the 60s. We had the tensions in the 70s over the Supreme Court and its decision to bus in order to integrate the society. All white neighborhoods in northern cities were engaging in violence in order to blow up school buses and intimidate African Americans, Black Americans, about coming to school in districts outside the neighborhood in which they lived. They lived in ghettoized inner cities. We have seen over the last several years situations in our cities. I'm thinking of Baltimore, I'm thinking of Ferguson, Missouri, where the racial tensions have become so acute, so sharp, that our police departments have begun to arm themselves as if they were engaging in warfare. Much of the armaments, many of the armored vehicles that were used in the Iraq War ended up in our cities, owned by the police forces in these cities. And they're being used to maintain peace in the inner city. And so in many cases, our inner cities have become like armed camps. And we've had incidents of the outbreak of violence and the shooting and killing of unarmed black males and many of these other things to contend with. Police departments armed to the teeth. Inner cities constantly tense. People tiptoeing around racial issues. All of these things because we've never really been willing to confront the reality of what race has been from the very beginning in this country. Parkinson's point is, and I think my point in our programming here is, that until we decide to confront the problem head on, we really don't have much chance to resolving it. Much of what we do is Band-Aid stuff. It doesn't get at the essence of the challenge. We have seen, as a result of this ongoing challenge through the years, we have seen, one of the things we see in our societies today is the explosion of gated communities, of opportunities for people who can afford it to move into gated communities so that they do not have to live with people that they would prefer not to engage with and live with. It used to be, I can remember when I was in school, the assumption was that moving into some of these gated communities was a hallmark of success in this society. The most successful people could afford to do that. And so the idea was that being successful enough to be able to afford this was a mark of success and a statement or a check mark for you on your abilities and the fact that you were willing to work hard and all the rest of it. What we see instead is that moving into these gated communities is not really a choice for all but certain selected people. It's almost like the traditional whites-only golf courses and clubs. I can remember when I lived in Richmond, Virginia in the 80s and 90s, late 80s and early 90s. White-only country clubs, golf clubs. I can remember at one point going into business with a relative, with a family member, and are thinking that joining one of these clubs, these country clubs, would be a good way to entertain potential clients. And we applied for membership and literally had to go through the requisite cocktail party. And it became very clear, I didn't know about it, think about it, until it actually happened and I saw it, that what the most important thing was not our business, it was our race. All of this, it seems to me, is an outgrowth of a persistent problem that we've neglected to address from the very beginning. That's the issue that I put on Facebook. I think it's a critically important one. I think in the fact that we've had a difficult time resolving the racial question in this society up to this point speaks to a strategy for addressing it. In other words, by understanding why we've not been able to solve it, it becomes more clear than ever what we have to do in order to successfully resolve it. These ideas of inequality, racial inequality, were built into the fabric of the Republic from the beginning. And I want to share with you a couple of things that I've picked up since then, which would indicate that we really haven't come that far. In resolving this. There's an article in an internet publication called truthout.org. If you go to truthout.org, you will find this article entitled, "This is a Country for White Men, White Supremacy in U.S. Politics." The publication date, Monday, January 16th, day before yesterday. The authors, Christopher Petrella and Amir Loggins. This article originally appeared in a publication called Black Perspectives. In light of what we've done with Annette Gordon Reed's review of Parkinson's book, I think some of the content in this particular article will make its own point. It'll be self-evident. This article begins by pointing out that this past December, last month, December 2016, one of the cable networks, A&E, Arts and Entertainment, announced that on January 10th, 2017, a new program was going to premiere on A&E entitled Generation KKK. This was to be an 8-part documentary series on the lives of Ku Klux Klan members and their families. Hours after the network announced that this program was going to begin airing in January, celebrities went on Twitter and other forms of social media to challenge the network for normalizing the KKK and giving a platform to hate groups. The outcry was so strong that the network canceled the program before it ever began. But the point of this article is the mere fact that one of our major networks had decided to air a program, 8 episodes, on the lives of Ku Klux Klan members and their families, demonstrates the extent to which the ideology of white America remains predominant in this society. That in effect, in the minds of many people, an organization like the KKK remains legitimate. And it's treated as such. These authors in this piece point to the fact that in 1963, Dr. Martin Luther King's very famous letter from a Birmingham jail makes the point that the greatest stumbling block to integration, to equality in this society was not the white citizens groups or the KKK. Martin Luther King argued that the biggest enemy to building equality into the society are white moderates. Those people who are more devoted to order than they are to justice. That, it seems to me, and what Martin Luther King says in that letter from Birmingham jail, speaks to the degree to which whiteness is considered to be in the mainstream, in the middle of what makes this republic function. And then the article recreates a number of examples to show that if you look at the origin or the office of President of the United States through the history of this country, you will see a fairly consistent commitment to these same principles. There's, in the minds of these authors, there's no better way to focus on the mainstream of what makes America tick than to look at how presidents and presidential candidates behaved before and after getting into office. And the article then contains a series of examples of this principle at play. "13 men who would eventually become president of the United States owned slaves. But many presidents, whether they owned slaves or not, normalized white supremacy in some of the things they said and did. And there's a litany of these, and I just want to run down very quickly before we take our break. In 1779, George Washington ordered General John Sullivan to destruct and devastate as many Native American settlements as possible. It will be essential to ruin their crops in the group and prevent their planting more, Washington said. A half century later, Andrew Jackson, in his 5th annual message to Congress in 1833, referenced Native Americans, indigenous peoples, as having neither the intelligence, the industry, the moral habits, or the desire of improvement, which are essential to any favorable change in their condition. Established in the midst of another and a superior race, and without appreciating the causes of their own inferiority, or seeking to control those causes, they must necessarily yield to the force of circumstances and ere long disappear," unquote. A few years before that, President James Monroe, in a letter to Andrew Jackson, made reference to what he called the hunter state of Native Americans, who maintained by warlike spirits present but a feeble resistance to the more dense, compact, and powerful populations of civilized men. The implication is, in both Jackson and James Monroe, that Native Americans are obviously inferior and will eventually disappear, and the culture that they represent must disappear with them. And of course, we're familiar with Jefferson's notes on the state of Virginia when he made the statement, quote, "Blacks are inferior to whites in the endowments both of body and mind." In 1858, just prior to the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln, in the 4th debate with Stephen Douglas, made the following statement: "I am not, nor ever have been, in favor of bringing about in any way the social and political equality of the white and black races. that I am not now or ever have been in favor of making voters or jurors of Negroes, nor of qualifying them to hold office, nor to intermarry with white people. And I, as much as any other man, am in favor of having the superior position assigned to the white race, unquote. That was Abraham Lincoln 2 years before the election of 1860 that brought him into the presidency. In 1865, James Garfield spoke directly to the assassinated Lincoln's theme of white superiority, and in a letter said that, quote, I have a strong feeling of repugnance when I think of the Negro being made our political equal, and I would be glad if they could be colonized, sent to heaven, or got rid of in any decent way, unquote. James Garfield, 1865. Andrew Johnson, quote, this is a country for white men, and by God, as long as I'm president, it shall be a government for white men. A decade later, President Ulysses S. Grant, in his second inaugural address, said that he would not ask that anything be done to advance the social status of the colored man, unquote. 1879, Rutherford B. Hayes referred to the Negroes and Indians as both weaker races. 1895, Theodore Roosevelt in the New York Review wrote that, quote, a perfectly stupid race can never rise to a very high plane. The Negro, for instance, has been kept down as much by a lack of intellectual development as by anything else. Woodrow Wilson described the KKK as great and veritable. William Howard Taft, social equality between the races shall be enforced by law. This has no foundation in fact. Warren G. Harding and Richard Nixon both rejected the mixing of the races, miscegenation. Harding in 1821 said that racial amalgamation there cannot be, unquote. Nixon advocated abortion when you have a situation of a black and a white producing a child. Lyndon Johnson referred to the Civil Rights Act of 1957 with the N-word. He called it the N-bill. Ronald Reagan, in a conversation with Lawrence Barrett in 1980, referred to the 1965 Voting Rights Act as, quote, humiliating to the South, unquote. Jimmy Carter expressed concern about the number of blacks in America who were intruding into white neighborhoods. Bill Clinton played golf at a whites-only club in Little Rock, Arkansas. Donald Trump, of course, made the statements he did, we know about, when it came to Mexicans. The key in all of this, it seems to me, is that there has been a significant assumption coming from the top, from the office of the presidency throughout our history, that white supremacy in this society is not peripheral to this society, it's central to it. Basically, then, the issue of allowing a group like the KKK to become considered normal is really unnecessary if you consider that it already constitutes what these authors claim is the heart and core of U.S. politics and society. I think the evidence is overwhelming. I think there's no question that we know what the problem is. Once you know what the problem is, you've got a chance of solving it. In the latest edition of the New York Review of Books, one of the books reviewed is a new one by Nicholas Guyat, G-U-Y-A-T-T. The title of the book is Bind Us Apart: How Enlightened Americans Invented Racial Segregation. And the basic theme of this book, according to the review in the New York Review of Books, is that throughout our history, forward-looking individuals who really saw the problem and wanted to find a way to address it were the victims of all kinds of blowback. Consequently, this book argues many of these people in the early years, in the early 19th century, began to lobby for and advocate for the overseas colonization of ex-slaves, of African Americans. The American Colonization Society was born in the early 19th century. It was created by liberal thinking people who recognized that there was so much hostility in this country to racial integration that the only way to solve the race problem was to move the ex-slaves out of the country. At the end of the 19th century, this same thinking led to segregation. Many of the people who were under normal circumstances would be leading the civil rights movement during the particular times in which they lived suffered such serious blowback, threats to families, and all the rest of it, that they begin to support the idea of segregation as far as the only thing they could do. This is as far as we can go. Integration we'll never have. The best we can hope for is a separate society in which eventually one side accepts the legitimacy of the other. That, you'll recall, was the basis of Booker T. Washington's famous Atlanta Compromise speech in 1895, when he said to white business leaders in Atlanta, socially and politically we will be as separate as the fingers of your hand. But in terms of economic development, we need to work together. You've got to give us the opportunity. In other words, the legitimacy of a segregated, racially separated society as being about as much as we could expect in this country. I think the evidence is overwhelming. And since we got into the Annette Gordon Reed piece the other day, I really felt that adding on the rest of this would kind of drive the point home as to what the nature of the issues are. I think we've probably gone a little bit beyond. Actually, we've gone quite a bit beyond the top of the hour. It's 9 minutes after the hour. So we are going to pause for take our 5-minute break, and then when we come back, we'll still have 45 minutes of program left here at the Virtual Center. You're listening to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. We're going to pause for 4 or 5 minutes, give all of us a chance to kind of unwind and take a couple of deep breaths as we reflect about some of these things. And then when we come back, we'll get into a totally different issue. Please stay with us. We'll be right back. Thank you, Agnes, and welcome to our second hour here at the Virtual Center. Actually, there's 45 minutes of that hour left, thanks to my inability to plan accurately, I guess I should say. I really thought that we would have 1 hour devoted to that particular issue, and then the second hour devoted to the issue that we're going to have less than 45 minutes on once we begin it. You are listening to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. We would love to hear from you on this, this issue that we dealt with in our first article, our first hour today, on the issue of America being from the very beginning a white-only situation, politically, socially, and every other way. It seems to me is a critically important one. It's one we continue to face all the time. I'm sure that everybody out there has things to say about it. My point is we would really appreciate hearing from you on some of these issues, and I want you to feel very comfortable, excuse me, in calling in, getting on the air, and sharing your thoughts with us. Our phone number is area code 304-663-4676. 304-663-4676. My email address, if you'd like to communicate with us that way, in a personal email to me, I would love to hear from you. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien, OBRIEN 906@gmail.com. And then again, our Facebook page. If you go to Facebook and you type in the search box at the top of the homepage, the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution, you will be into our Facebook page, and the entry on Facebook, along with the link to Dr. Gordon Reed's article that we referred to in our first hour, is on there. The link to the article is on there, as well as a fairly substantial, lengthy comment of mine on the particular issue. It deals with some of the things that we included in our first hour. I might say that the issue that I'd like to address now in the second segment is the product of an item that's on Facebook as well. I think we made reference to this the other day. And this is a reference to the controversy, the political controversy that has emerged from Donald Trump's press conference last Wednesday, in which he attacked the media, more specifically CNN. And it related to the CNN's complicity with BuzzFeed in publication of the dossier on his personal behavior that was very, very humiliating, much of which could not be validated. And it's at that Donald Trump accused CNN of fake news, the media of being dishonest. And we dealt with that issue before and how serious it was to attack the media. And we spent most of our time focusing on the role of a free press in this republic in order for popular government to work. And of course, we cited specifically the quote from the letter of James Madison, in which Madison talked about the need for popular information in order to make a popular government work. And his argument is that knowledge will forever govern ignorance, and a people who would be their own governors must arm themselves with the power which knowledge gives. We spent quite a bit of time on that particular issue. And it originally appeared in an article whose author was Leonard Downey. Downey was a retired news editor from the Washington Post who's now teaching journalism at Arizona State University. And he had an op-ed piece in the New York Times on the 13th of this month, which is late last week, in which he talked about the what I call the kerfuffle between BuzzFeed, CNN, and Donald Trump. I might share with you the fact that just last night on Fox News, Donald Trump appeared and was asked a specific question about his use of Twitter. And he reinforced the elements of this attack on the media. He basically said that the only reason he continues to employ Twitter is because it gives him a weapon to fight back against what he called a crooked, dishonest media who is engaging in fake news and half-truths and disinformation and all the rest of it in order to attack his legitimacy as president. And, of course, the issue that stimulated all of this was the controversy between him and John Lewis, who raised the question of Donald Trump's legitimacy, if you know, late last week in taping a program for Meet the Press, which appeared Sunday morning. So this particular issue between Donald Trump and the media has not passed, with the press conference held last Wednesday. It continues to exist, and Donald Trump made the statement that if he could rely on the media being honest, he'd never resort to Twitter again. And I think if you believe that, it seems to me I don't, but that's just my own preference. Yesterday on our Facebook page, I put up a link to an article on the issue of a word with Russian origins called kompromat, Kompromat, kompromat. The title of the article is Kompromat and the Danger of Doubt and Confusion in a Democracy. The author, Amanda Taub. Publication date, January 15th. Today's the 18th, so this was 3 days ago. I read the article. I posted the link on our Facebook page, and I made some comments about it. I've received a number of reactions to these comments, and I wanted to share with them with you. More specifically, I wanted to share some of the comments I made about this article and this concept of kompromat. Basically, what I said was that, I guess we can't be surprised as we near the inauguration of Donald Trump, given the kinds of things that are going on, that we're now wrestling with a new word that we hear being thrown around all the time, the word called kompromat. I said, we've moved far beyond the idea of disinformation. This word, kompromat, means much more than disinformation. We moved way beyond it. In fact, we've come full circle, all the way to the idea that there's really not information out there to be had at all. In other words, many people are beginning to question whether anything is a fact, whether anything is true. Many people make reference to this idea as what they call post-truth, that we've reached the point where people really believe that they don't have the ability to distinguish between real information and fake information, that they can't tell the difference between information that may really be information and information that may not be. Only the possibility that what we're told could be real information, but it might not be. So the best way that we can handle this is to prepare ourselves for whatever might come next. Real news? Fake news? News that's been planted for political purposes? Outright lies? Who knows? We can't really know. So the best thing for us to do is to make ready. Make sure that whatever happens next, we're not totally thrown by it. The word compromat. The author, Amanda Taub. This is one paragraph from her article. In fact, she says, compromat is more than an individual piece of damaging information. It's a broader attempt to manufacture public cynicism and confusion in ways that target not just one individual, but an entire society. By eroding the very idea of a shared reality, by spreading apathy and confusion among a public that learns to distrust its leaders and its institutions, compromat undermines a society's ability to hold the powerful to account and ensure the proper functioning of government itself. Unquote. Here's my comment on that particular paragraph. What we're talking about with the word compromat is the intentional confusion of an entire society to the point that cynicism reigns supreme. People learn that they can't trust anybody about anything. Why worry about it? Most people don't worry about it. The result is that if people stop worrying about this stuff, then those in power don't have to worry about being touched by scandal. They're not accountable to anybody. They're virtually immune from public scrutiny. With Friday's inauguration, it's appearing more and more like we're in for a huge dose of compromat. We've reached a point already in this nation where people really don't know what to believe about things that used to matter. What we know for sure is that those who question are in for a tough time. So the best thing to do is lay low, not say much. Basically, then, most of what we thought we knew isn't quite what we thought it was. Much of what we expected to happen is not going to work out the way we thought it would. So we got to prepare to be surprised, even disappointed. So the best thing to do is to get ready so that whatever happens isn't going to jolt us too much. Amanda Taub tells us that the word compromat is a combination of two Russian words for compromising an information. And she says, in relationship to specific leaks may aim at powerful individuals, but in the longer term, compromat serves the interest of the powerful. It becomes a tool of autocrats. By eroding the idea of shared reality, by spreading confusion, basically, we create a result where the vast numbers of people in society really don't know what to believe. They don't know what's true. They don't know what's fake. They don't know if what they're hearing is a combination of the two. Consequently, people are feeling comfortable rejecting evidence. They reject the facts. They deny the reality of facts. Just yesterday, during one of the hearings for one of Donald Trump's nominees for a high-level position, the issue came up of climate change. And the nominee made the point and said, there really are different points of view on that. At that point, Bernie Sanders, who was on the panel asking the questions, the confirmation panel, interjected and made the point to the nominee and said, actually, there really isn't that much competing question about climate change. The fact of the matter is most reputable scientists throughout the world agree pretty much on the facts of climate change. But what Sanders was pointing to is the argument or the idea that different people think different things about climate change. And there really isn't a right and a wrong to this. That it just depends on what you believe. And more specifically, it depends ultimately on which side is most persuasive in getting you to believe their particular position. So the argument is that there really isn't fact. There really isn't truth. I can remember when the very, very well-known book, Closing of the American Mind, came out in the late 60s. The whole point of that was an attack on the idea of relativism. The whole point of the Closing of the American Mind was based on the theme that our education system was teaching relativism. That what we had begun to do is increasingly deny the absolute nature of truth. That what we were doing is saying that they really aren't absolutes. There really aren't things that are absolutely true. That rather these are matters of perspective, matters of context. That what truth is in one particular context becomes a non-truth when you look at it from a different perspective or a different way. It's the idea of relativism. The term relativism is one, I remember the very famous example of relativism on the issue of time. And the position was, the argument was that time can be relative. If you put your finger on a hot stove, 1 second seems like an eternity. If you're looking at something beautiful, a landscape, a range of mountains, a beautiful woman, for example, then half an hour becomes fleeting. In other words, it all depends on the circumstances. And out of that, if you remember, came the term circumstantial ethics. That ethics that right and wrong change depending on the particular context. And questions that we used to answer in classrooms were questions like, is it ever legitimate to steal or to lie? And the assumption was to encourage young people to recognize the realities of relativism. And the Closing of the American Mind challenged that and argued instead that there are absolutes. And the author went all the way back to the ancients, to the classics, and pointed out the traditions of the West, which essentially established the validity of absolute truth. Went back to the writings of Aristotle and Plato and these other things. All of that's changed because now we've reached the point where we've even gone beyond relativism, where the general population really is unsure whether there's truth or not. The one thing most people will say is that I'm not sure whether there's truth or not. The one thing I know is I'm never going to be able to tell the difference. The best thing I do is prepare for the unknown. The result is that you end up with a society which becomes very confused, sure of itself. What you've done is you've conflated the idea of truth with the idea of opinion. You've basically said that in the human world, in the social world, the world of politics, the world of interactions of people, we have differences of opinion on major issues. And the only way that people can live together is to accept the idea that there are different opinions, different points of view on things, and that the idea that one side is right and one side is wrong, one side is privy to truth, the other side is lying, it's very divisive. It works against the best interests of your political system. As I mentioned at the conclusion of our program on Monday, an article was printed in 1967 by Hannah Arendt. And the title of her article was Truth and Politics. And in that particular article, Hannah Arendt addressed the conflict and the controversy between truth and politics and the basic incompatibility between the two. I wanted to share with you her first paragraph in this particular article because it raises some of the disturbing questions that we continue to confront in this kind of an issue. I will tell you that Hannah Arendt's article, it appeared in the New Yorker on the 25th of February, 1967, is available online if you Google it. It's heavy slogging. Let me tell you, it's a difficult article. I've read it this past weekend. I read it twice. It's really difficult because it's deep. It's philosophy. Let me share with you her first paragraph. The subject of these reflections, she said, is a commonplace. No one has ever doubted that truth and politics are on rather bad terms with each other. People have known forever that truth and politics tend to be hostile to each other. And no one, as far as I know, she says, has ever counted truthfulness among the political virtues. Politicians, by definition, have never been able to be successful by claiming access to truth. They have always been regarded as necessary, justifiable tools, not only of the politician or the demagogue, but of the statesman as well. For a long time throughout history, there's been a general realization that when you're in the world of politics, you're in a world which finds the truth very uncomfortable. And most people who have looked at the world of politics have pretty much accepted the fact that lying and half-truths and all the rest of it seem to be part of that particular situation. Why is that true, she said? What does it mean for the nature and dignity of the political realm of politics on one side, and for the nature and the dignity of truth and truthfulness on the other? Is it of the very essence of truth to be impotent, and the very essence of power to be deceitful? By definition, does the truth have no power, have no influence? By definition, does truth always take a back seat once it enters the world of politics? Why do we accept that? What kind of reality does the truth possess if it's powerless in the public realm? Finally, she says, is not impotent truth just as despicable as power that gives no heed to truth? She admits that these are uncomfortable questions, but they arise in our contemporary world. And then she goes back and addresses a little bit of the background, a little bit of the history of the conflict between truth and politics. She said that history is old and it's complicated. Throughout history, truth seekers and truth tellers have been aware of the risks of their business. As long as they did not interfere with the course of the world, they were covered with ridicule, but he who forced his fellow citizens to take him seriously by trying to set him free from falsehood and illusion was in danger of his life. From the very beginning, almost, she says, those people who claim access to the truth have been considered dangerous. Their lives have become in danger. She goes all the way back to Plato's allegory of the cave. Plato's conflict between the truth teller and citizens, she says, goes all the way back. And you remember the story of the allegory of the cave, where one person is permitted to leave the cave and to see reality, and then re-enters the cave and is challenged to share with those that are still chained within the cave, believing that the shadows they see playing out on the wall are real. The person who has seen truth comes back and is challenged to convey the truth to these people whose whole lives have been lived in the shadows. Plato says, quote, if they could lay hands on such a man, they would kill him, unquote. In the 16th century, Thomas Hobbes, the British political philosopher, makes the statement, I doubt not, but if it had been a thing contrary to any man's right of dominion, or to the interest of men that have dominion, that the 3 angles of a triangle should be equal to 2 angles of a square, the doctrine should have been, if not disputed, yet by the burning of all books of geometry suppressed, as far as he whom it concerned was able. In other words, what Hannah Arendt is saying here is if you go all the way back to Plato, or to the beginning of the modern period with Thomas Hobbes, the one thing you consistently find is that those people who claim to have the truth never find it easy to convey that truth to those that don't have it. In fact, their lives become threatened. What that means is, and this is the important thing, I think, what that means is that for much of our history, those who claim to have the truth have been reduced to not being key players in the societies in which they've lived and worked. That they tend to be isolated. The argument is these people who claim to have truth can't really function effectively in mainstream society, so they need to go off by themselves into churches and monasteries and later universities, where these people engage in debates about the truth and engage in logic and in analysis and cognitive theory and all the rest of it. No problem, society has decided, so long as they don't try to come beyond the walls of the convent or the walls of the abbey or the monastery or the walls of the university in which they live and work, and come out into mainstream society. Translation: as long as we don't have to deal with them, then let them play their games, as long as their games don't have an impact on my life. That's the point that Hannah Arendt is making. That for much of our history, we have tended to push truth into the background. We let people claim to have access to it, provided they don't make us deal with it. What we've done is we've moved into a totally different realm when it comes to the relationship between truth and politics. This is, I think, extremely important. She said, for the modern age, which believes that truth is neither given to nor disclosed to, but produced by the human mind, has assigned since Leibniz mathematical, scientific, and philosophical truths to the common species of rational truth, as distinguished from fashionable truth. Beginning with the Enlightenment, beginning with the modern scientific revolution, basically we have moved into the realm of rational truth. We have begun to separate or distinguish between rational truth, which the human mind discovers, and factual truth, which is independent of any mind. Traditionally, man believed that truth was an absolute, that there were certain things that were absolutely true and unquestioned. But with the modern period and with the scientific revolution, we entered the age of what we call rational truth. That what we consider to be true must undergo certain cognitive, mental gymnastics to prove it. The educated world came together around the principle of rational truth. And that is the idea of logic or analysis. The issue of lies, out and out untruths, hadn't yet raised its head. Politically, the relevant truths were factual. The conflict between truth and politics was first discovered with respect to rational truth. The opposite of a rationally true statement is either error and ignorance, as in the sciences, or illusion or opinion, as in philosophy. In Plato, the truth-teller is in danger of his life. In Hobbes, where he has become an author, he's threatened with the burning of his books. But lying, untruth, is not an issue. It's the sophist and the ignoramus, rather than the liar, who take up Plato's time. Plato is much more interested in errors of analysis, errors of rational thinking, than he is with intentional untruth. Basically, then, what we're talking about from this time forward is the idea of opinion. Political society is willing to accept the idea of opinion, but the minute you accept that, you accept also the idea that different people have different opinions. So the question is, are they equally legitimate? For a long time, we denied that. For a long time, in fact, the other day when I was making reference to this, I denied it as well. It has been my position, always, that one man's opinion is not as good as another man's opinion. If you can back up your opinion with analysis, with concrete evidence, with research, with substance. In other words, if you can approach what society calls rational truth in support of your opinion, then that means, and an educated man has pretty much agreed to it, that your truth is much more important. Your opinion is much more important than somebody else who doesn't have that. But once you introduce untruth into the equation, once you introduce fake news, lies, disinformation, half-truths, then you create the point that we were talking about with compromise. Namely, people don't know what to believe. People don't know what's true anymore. What makes the debate over climate so controversial is that science is demanding that general societies at large, that masses of people accept the validity of their truth. The problem is that many people have become convinced that there really is no truth, that there are just different opinions, and that one opinion is as good as another. And that's what President-elect Trump's nominee made the point. I think it was the nominee for the Energy Department, but I'm not sure. Made the point in response to questions yesterday about climate change. Bernie Sanders made the point that science is pretty well unanimous in what it's saying about climate change. What he is insisting upon is that this is validated truth. People have no choice but to accept it. What the nominee is saying is, oh no, that's what the scientists say, but that's their opinion. I happen to have my.
Thank you all for listening today to the Virtual Center with our host, Dr. Bill O'Brien. There's some technical issues on the line, so unfortunately we're cutting today short. And we will be back Monday at 1 p.m., and we hope to see you here. Thank you all for joining us.